Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. To what's going to be a pre-release analysis on Wanderer / Scaramouche / Worm. This pre-release analysis is going to be coming out a little bit later than it usually does, because I'm recording it a lot later than I usually do, because I went to New York for Anime NYC. Right now I'm feeling okay, but towards the end of the video you might start noticing that my voice is a little bit fucked. I guess I'll just quickly cover that before actually getting into the pre-release, because I know there's a lot of people that don't watch Twitch. So basically, I had a pretty nice time, did a bunch of cool shit, met a bunch of really cool people. The convention itself was fucking garbage. The Genshin booth was pretty shit, and I wasn't really intending on buying much, so like the merch stuff, nothing was really all that interesting. But yeah, huge thanks to Mr. Socks for paying for my plane ticket. Hashtag ad sponsored by Ziox, true. And also thanks to Angelus, who organized the party I ended up going to. Oh yeah, and to Unreal Dreamer for fucking inviting me out to lunch and covering the bill. That was pretty pog. I also met a bunch of other really cool people who I'll probably leave in the description as well. I met Tenten. Tenten is so short, dude. Holy fuck. Tenten was wearing heels like this high, and he was still shorter than me. And I'm 4'11". Anyways, base HP, base attack, base defense, crit rate ascension. So the crit rate ascension is obviously always nice. Generally, depending on the kind of stat distributions you have and the kind of buffs you get and the kind of artifacts you end up being able to go for, at a baseline, damage percent ascension is better than crit ascension. But if you start having a lot of damage percent buffs, either in your kit or in the teams where you use a character, then crit can end up edging out. In Scaramouche's case, he doesn't really have a lot of damage percent. I mean, he doesn't have damage percent in his kit itself here, but the set bonus that's coming out with him is 40% normal and charge attack damage, and if you end up playing him with Farazan, that's another like 30 to 40% as well, which means that him being crit is like about as good as damage percent would be. It's not a massive difference basically. So the base attack also, like, that's relatively high in base attack, but not much to say about that. The base defense and the base HP are actually relevant. These are very low. For context, right, Nahida, who's a character who's pretty known for how squishy she is, 196 more HP and 23 more defense, which means that Wanderer is just objectively squishier. That being said, you do get to fly up, which gives you another dimension to dodge attacks, but there's some enemies that when you're very high up in the air, they change the attack patterns that they use, and some of those attack patterns are very, very bad for you. So you don't necessarily want to like dodge by going very high, because that can make the enemies use their range attack patterns, which are very, very often the ones you don't want them to use. Let's look at his stat lines. Normal attacks are pretty straightforward. Performs up to 3 attacks using wind blades, dealing animo damage. Charge attack consumes a certain amount of stamina, gathers a buildup of high wind pressure, and deals AoE animo damage after a short cast time. If we look at the scaling at level 9, which is generally what I look at, none of his attacks are particularly high. However, for the speed at which they come out, they're actually pretty decent. Yeah, Ayato's a good point of comparison, thank you. Right, the motion values on Ayato's like slashes and his E is about 110 average-ish each, plus a little bit of scaling from his HP that doesn't do that much, but it's the equivalent of like 120-ish or something. That's about as much as Scaramouche does on his first 2 hits, and then his third hit hits for more. His charge attack also hits for a pretty decent amount. But if it was just for that, his normal attacks and charge attacks wouldn't be that great. Where he can actually end up shining, and where he can actually end up becoming pretty good, is when you look at his E. So his E concentrates the power of the winds to break free from the shackles of the earth, dealing AoE animo damage before leaping into the air and entering the wind-favored state. When favored, the Wanderer cannot perform plunging attacks in this state. Oh no, no plunge attacks. That's like Child's E, right? That sucks. Oh, when he uses normal and charge attacks, they will be converted into blah blah blah. The damage they deal and their AoE will be increased, and their damage will be considered normal and charge attack respectively. The Wanderer will hover persistently during this time. So, the reason why you can't do plunge attacks is because you're flying and you can still use your normal attack. So it's not like Child, where when you're in the air you can't do anything. While this state is active, the Wanderer's movement gain the following properties. Persistently consumes Kugoryoku points to maintain this hovering state. When sprinting, additional Kugoryoku points will be consumed for the Wanderer to accelerate midair. Holding sprint will cause persistent Kugoryoku point consumption to maintain speed. This effect will replace his default sprint. Jumping expands extra Kugoryoku points to increase hovering height. Holding jump will cause permanent Kugoryoku point consumption to keep increasing hovering height. Running out of Kugoryoku points will end the wind favored state. A second cast during the duration of wind favored will also end it. So here are the important lines in here. The damage they deal in their AoE will be increased, their damage will be considered normal and charge attack damage, and his charge attacks will not consume stamina. Effectively, when you use your E, you start flying, and instead of your normal stamina bar, you gain a second stamina bar. That second stamina bar is basically how long you can fly. Doing things will make it go down, and once it runs down, or once it runs out, you fall out of it. The thing is, while that's active, your charge attacks don't consume any stamina, and they don't make the thing go down faster than normal attacks do, which is very relevant. We'll get into it later. We haven't had the live stream yet, but by the time this video comes out, the live stream will have happened because it's tomorrow morning. But we have seen footage of Scaramouche's attacks, and his normal attacks seem to have very, very small AoE, whereas his charge attacks seem to have a pretty decent AoE, which means that his charge attacks are going to be his main form of AoE damage, which means that the fact that they don't consume stamina is very, very, very relevant. Burst compresses the atmosphere into a singular vacuum that grinds all troubles away, dealing multiple instances of AoE animo damage. If the character is in the wind favored state, the wind favored state will end after casting. So it seems like you get up to 4 particles. I'm not entirely sure on that, but let's for now assume that up to 4 particles during his E. Now, depending on what team you end up going for, obviously that's going to affect how much energy you're generating. But assuming for now C0 Farazan, let's say Bennett Singto for now, just because it's simple to calc. This is gonna heavily depend on which team you use and the constellations on your characters. But at a baseline, you're generating about 30 energy, and that's with 2 favs on your team. A team with an average amount of particle generation, not like a crazy amount, but also not like very little, which means that you need to have 180 ER. Now, the biggest issue that you have is that looking at the actual scaling on it, right? His burst is about 1250 motion value. His normal attacks, let's say he's spamming charge attacks and you don't get that many, right? Let's say you only get 10, which you definitely can get more. That's 2.2k multiplied by 1.4, so it's about 3k motion value. So basically, even if you burst every rotation, his burst is not that big of a portion of his damage, and he doesn't actually have a passive that relies on him using his burst. Which means that if this is the kind of team you end up going for with C0 Farazan and not that much energy generation, your ER requirements for you to use burst every rotation are so high that it is not worth using your burst every rotation, and you're better off using your burst every other rotation. Now, obviously, if you end up playing a team that has more energy generation, you can reach the kind of ER requirements that are realistic to get with substats only and not that many. All right, so let's say you use C6 Farazan, that increases your particle generation by already a pretty large amount. So instead of only 2 particles, you generate about 6, and instead of them happening here, they can happen here. So that's an additional 4 particles, basically 4 animal particles while he's on the field, which is pretty significant, and that by itself puts his ER requirement to more realistic ranges. Even though at 135 I'm still not sure I'd necessarily recommend it, because it's not that much damage, and you have to use it at the end of your E because it cancels your E. When you use burst, it removes your E, which means you can't really use it to front load damage either. But if you end up going for this, and instead of going Bennett Singto, you end up going for, like, I don't know, you need a better grouper on your team, so you add a Venti. Let's say he gets 2 E's per rotation, you funnel one of them into him, right? You do that instead of Singto, right? Like that. This is very easy to reach, and that's fine. Oh yeah, also, if you stay in his E for as long as you can, and you don't dash too much to like make your E last like less time, it is very possible that your buffs run out before you use your burst. That's another thing to keep in mind, because if your buffs run out before you use your burst, then your burst isn't the like 30-ish% of your damage that it can be. It's more like 15%, and then that kind of sucks. All of this to say, Scaramouche's burst is fine. It's not a bad burst. It's not Yoimiya. You want to use it. You want to press the button. But it's also not a burst that you need to build around, and a burst that you need to really get enough ER to make sure that you can use. It's fine if you don't. It's not the end of the world. All right, let's get into his passives. Let's start with this one, because this one kind of sucks. When you hit an opponent with your normal or charge attacks, you have a chance to obtain the descent effect. Next time you dash in midair, you don't consume your like green stamina thing, and it launches arrows that deal a little bit of damage to enemies. So there's 2 issues with that. The main issue is that it's unfortunately unreliable. Basically, we can model how this ends up working out. So on the first one, you have 16%. So the odds that it takes you 1 are 16%. The odds that it takes you 2, well, you have to miss on 1, so it's 1 minus 16%, and then an additional 12%. It's about 23%. So it can take up to 8, Most of the time it's gonna happen in the first 5. The average amount of hits that it's gonna take is gonna be 3. So if you do N3, you'll do 4 hits, which means that the odds that you get it are about 83%, which is pretty good. But if you build a combo around that, you do N3 dash, you'll sometimes get it, and then sometimes you won't, and when you don't get it, you fuck over your DPS. And the biggest issue that it has is basically just that it's not that much damage. So is it really worth doing? It might be. Like, that's the reality, is it might be. It's very, very hard to tell. I'd have to analyze the frames a lot more than I already have. I don't trust pre-release footage enough to spend hours of sanity going through it and min-maxing the combo when it's probably gonna get fucking changed anyways. I'll talk about it in the post-release for sure, but my thoughts on this passive is that, like, it's nice that it's there because if you need to dash to dodge something, this passive can make it so that sometimes you don't actually lose uptime because of your dash, but I don't necessarily think it's that great. We'll have to see. I think that the main use for this will not be to incorporate it in a combo. I think the main use for this will just be to be happy that it lets you dash without losing your stamina thing. But it's very possible that people end up finding out combos that make this work fine. The biggest issue with it is that it doesn't count as normal attack damage or as skill damage or as burst damage. It doesn't have a damage type, which means that A, you can't use it to refresh buffs that work on skill and burst, like for example the Solar Pearl. If they made it skill damage, it would be a pretty big buff to Solar Pearl, because Solar Pearl has pretty big uptime issues, which we'll talk about when we get into the weapon section. If it was normal or charge attack damage, then you could benefit from his set bonus in terms of damage. So fingers crossed that they change it before he makes it to live, and they make it skill damage or burst damage. It would make sense for it to be skill damage, so fingers crossed, hopefully they do that, but I don't expect them to. And then finally, his other, I mean, there's this, which doesn't matter. Wow, cool. You can save some Mora. Did you know? You can spend 200 real-life dollars to save like 10,000 Mora every 3 months. Isn't that great? It doesn't work on leveling them up. And most of the Mora, when it comes to weapons, is the level up part, not the ascension. Anyway, point being, these passives suck. They're not good. This passive is actually pretty good. I'm still not entirely sure how much he actually gains from the Hydro thing. It's a decent amount. It's nice to have it, but the biggest issue is that he is going to reach periods of uptime that are long enough for his support stuff to expire, which means that staying on him for longer at the price of extending your rotation won't always be worth it, which means that the Hydro buff, while it's nice to have the option to stay on him longer, won't always be good. It won't always be a good idea to use it. The Electro one, we've talked about his energy requirements a little bit, right? Let's bring this back to what it is with C0 Farazan as the only other Animo unit, around 180. If you get the Electro thing and you end up doing normal attack spam, I don't think you get 2 of these from his N3. I think you only get 1. If you do normal attack spam, you get about 6 N3s. It depends on weapons, it depends on artifact, whatever, but about 6 N3s, so 18 attacks, right? Which helps his ER requirements quite a bit. You play him with an Electro unit, it's unlikely to be an Electro unit that needs high ER, so it's more likely to be someone like Fischl, or you're gonna play him with 2 Electro units, in which case you'll still have Fischl. Fischl generates more energy than someone like Xingqiu would, so you get more something like, instead of 5, you get closer to like 10-ish. If you end up getting Electro Resonance, that can actually go up quite a bit. Point being, with the Electro thing, you can end up in ER requirement ranges that are more realistic to reach, but, and this is pretty important, it can still not be enough. If you need 140 ER to use his burst every rotation, it's still a little bit difficult to justify it. Generally gonna be worth doing, but it's gonna feel really bad because all your numbers are gonna be significantly lower in order for you to be able to get that burst, and the actual gain is gonna be incredibly minor because his burst just isn't that good. Basically, the biggest problem with his Electro thing is just that it doesn't restore enough energy to really push him over the line of being able to use his burst every rotation unless you have multiple forms of energy generation on your team. So for example, if you have C6 Farazan plus his Electro thing, then he kind of has enough. Because C6 Farazan adds particles generated to get something closer to this, and then yeah, like you're fucking vibing, right? So that leaves us with the 2 remaining buffs, which are the Pyro and the Cryo buff, which respectively give 30% attack and 20% crit rate. So the Electro buff can be good if you want to use his burst every rotation, because it means that you don't need as much ER. But because you don't necessarily want to use his burst every rotation, if you're playing him in a team where he doesn't really want to use his burst every rotation, then the Electro buff doesn't really do much. The Pyro pyro and the cryo buff will always be useful. They'll always give you a certain amount, and the amount that they give is always going to be pretty good. The cryo one will generally be a little bit better than the pyro one, depending on which specific team you end up going for. Attack percent isn't as bad as people think it is very often, so don't discount the pyro buff. But as a general rule, the cryo buff is like a little bit better, simply because the number on it is pretty big. 30% attack and 20% crit rate are about the same in terms of opportunity cost. When you get a crit rate sub, it's 3.3%, and when you get an attack percent subs, it's 5%, which is about 50% more. When you get a crit rate main stat, it's 31.1%, attack percent 46.6%. Again, about 50% more. The way that the stats are weighted in this game is crit rate to attack to crit damage is generally 1.52 in terms of how much you get on a given piece, which means that the numbers on this make sense. They're what you would expect out of a similar thing. Now, I've talked very often about how attack percent is very underrated, and it is, but the main reason that attack percent is very overrated, attack percent is very underrated is because artifact RNG won't always just let you have the perfect artifact. And if you can't get the perfect artifact, if you can't choose the stats that your artifact gets, and because it is a lot of RNG and a lot of layers of RNG, then it's very likely that you have artifacts that have attack percent that are overall better and that will increase your damage more than artifacts that have more crit, just because they might just have more of the stats. They might have substat roll that are a high roll instead of a low roll. It could be a 5.8% attack roll versus a 2.7% crit roll. Then there's also, if you don't get a lot of external attack buffs, attack percent is pretty solid to begin with, but the more attack percent, the more attack buffs you get, the lower the value of attack percent. Whereas with the way that crit works, the scaling is not actually linear. It has it's not exactly exponential, but it has a pseudo exponential element to it, which means that it doesn't fall off basically, or it takes a lot longer to fall off. The biggest issue with this is that Scaramouche doesn't have synergy with a lot of pyro characters, and the characters he does have synergy with either give him a lot of attack already, which makes the value of attack percent worse, kind of rely on you having a second pyro character, which gives a lot of attack, or can end up just not being all that valuable simply because their numbers aren't good enough. But we'll talk about that more when we get to team sections. However, I would recommend not discounting Toma just yet. The main reason for that is because, right, like we said, he's pretty squishy, and most importantly, this doesn't give him resistance to interruption. I cannot stress how important it is for normal attack spammers to have at least one form of resistance to interruption. Otherwise, they will just fucking cry. You look at Ayato. Kamisato Ayato's resistance to interruption is increased. Increase Hutao's resistance to interruption. The character that doesn't have that is Yoimiya. And if you've ever played Yoimiya without any form of resistance to interruption, if you've ever played like Yoimiya, Bennett, Kazuha, Yelan, it's rough. Or if you end up not going higher than your initial E on Wanderer, there are some attacks that you'll dodge at basically no cost just because you're slightly in the air. But not having any resistance to interruption is really bad because it can fuck over the combos you're trying to do, because it can cancel you very easily. Which means that it's very valuable to have at least one form of resistance to interruption in your party with them. But yeah, and when it comes to the cryo unit, the biggest issue that most of the cryo units have is that there's not really a cryo unit that has really good energy generation and really good damage. You can go Rosaria, but you're gonna need to get a lot of ER if she's solo cryo. Same for Ganyu, same for Keiya, same for Ayaka if you want to, which is going to reduce the amount of damage that they can do. Most cryo teams end up having 2 cryo units, and while yeah, one of the reasons for that is you're freezing enemies, and when you're freezing enemies, you don't want to apply pyro to them to remove the freeze, because then they're not frozen anymore, which limits the amount of elements you can put in your party, sure, and also your cryo units can wear Blizzard Trigger and do a fuck ton more damage, and that's cool. But another very significant reason why you generally see cryo teams with 2 cryo characters is because cryo characters often struggle batterying themselves, and when you play them solo, you'll need to get them a lot more ER, which means that their damage goes down. And then if you're playing 2 cryo characters, then your second cryo character doesn't give you this, whereas if you got a pyro character instead, you'd get the 30% attack, which which is pretty fucking significant. Basically, the point of this is just that, well, yes, the cryo buff is better. Cryo units in general are harder to make work with only one cryo unit than the pyro units that can work with Scaramouche. I forgot the Constellations. Let's get through them real quick. Attack speed increased. Pog. It's nice, but it doesn't do that much. 10% attack speed. It's okay, I guess. And you get a bit more damage when you get your dash from A4. It's fine. C2 makes your burst deal a lot more damage. It's not like multiplicative. It's damage percent that's additive with the rest of your damage percent sources, but it's still a pretty nice nuke. The thing is, you can't really front load it because like you only gain the additional damage if you use it towards the end of your E, not if you use it before or like at the beginning of your E. So it's kind of backloaded, which is a bit unfortunate. His C, that's C5. It's Okage. Wait, C3, sorry. It's his burst. It's Okage. His C4. His C4 is kind of bad, actually. A lot of the time, you don't really care that much about the buffs you don't have. And even if you do, you can't really rely on which one you're gonna get. It's not bad, but it's unreliable, which makes it meh, whatever. His C5 is kind of meh. And then his C6 is pretty good. His biggest issue is that he's kind of like Ito in the sense that from Constellations 0 to Constellation 5, there's not actually that much of a difference. And then C6 is a pretty nice bump. His C2 is better than Ito's C2, I'd say, because it gives him a different use case for nuking stuff, but its restriction on only really being usable at the end of your burst is kind of meh for me. And the reason why they did it like this, the reason they made it like Ito, is because they made Farazan kind of a unit that you want to get C6 for if you really want to use her, which means that you're probably going to get or Wanderer Constellations along the way, because yeah, the average amount of wishes that it takes to C6 4-star, I forgot how much it was. This is not exactly accurate, but it's like, which leaves us with about 34 wishes average for each Farazan. You need 7 of them. Now, obviously, this is very approximate. Probability is a little bit more complicated than that, but about 240 wishes is the average-ish. 240 wishes is guaranteed at least 2 pities, almost always 3 pities because of soft pity, which means that you can basically almost guarantee, if you're not on 50-50, you can guarantee Scaramouche C1. And the average outcome is going to be like C1.5 or something. So what that means is that if you go for Farazan C6, you're relatively likely to end up between C1 and C3 on Scaramouche or Wanderer or whatever, which is why they didn't make his early Constellations all that good. They could have went the other way, but like they did with Raiden, I guess they just didn't want to. Honestly, I don't know why. But yeah, his cons are meh. I wouldn't say any of his cons from 1 to 5 are really worth much. Like, they're nice to have, I guess, but they're not something you want to aim for. And then his C6 is like, I mean, it's good, but it's not insane. Kind of just like, yeah. It's obviously a good for a Constellation, but for a C6, it's kind of like what you'd expect. And considering he doesn't have the greatest Constellations before it, then C0 to C6 isn't that massive of a difference. It's still going to be pretty big. I'd say if you're hesitating between Constellations on him and his weapon, honestly, I don't even know what I'd recommend. I think neither is that great, but if you really want to get one, I'd probably go for Constellations a little bit more, because then that way you can get a few Farazans along the way, but I don't know. I don't think any of them is like that great. Anyways, that's it for Constellations. Now we're probably gonna have a pretty long time lapse because I haven't made a sheet for him yet. Or like, I have made a sheet, but it's not like a great sheet, so I'll make a good sheet. Now that we have this sheet done, I'm not gonna actually show the sheet in the video because there's a bunch of assumptions that are like not necessarily accurate, but we can get going or get started on the like all the sheet thing stuff. Let's talk about all his weapons. So he has the bell, right? His weapon is the bell. I'm not calling it by its name. For me, it's the bell. It's a bell. It's the bell. What else do we have? We have 1,000 Floating Dreams. Let's not even bother. Kaguras Verity, we'll talk about a little bit. Good take. Memory of Dust, Lost Prayers, Skyward Atlas, Dodoco, Tails, Eye of Perception, Blackliff, Mappa, Mare, Solar, Pearl, Widsith, Favj. These are the possible weapons you can put on him. And I guess TTDS. Let's start with these two. I wouldn't recommend them. Scaramouche is a character that is very much balanced around him being the one who deals damage. I think that while technically you can just play him as an on-fielder for taser teams and stuff like that, and like not really build him for damage and just use him for utility, for VV, whatever, it's not really something I'd recommend. I think you can play him in taser with VV and all that, but I still think you'd want to focus on his damage and build him with damage. And I don't think that Fav or TTDS are generally going to be the play on him. So I'm just going to take them out. Let's go through his real options. So the bell is his obvious, it's a signature weapon, so it's his obvious best in slot. Or is it? The thing about the bell is that it buffs normal attack damage and it does not buff charge attack damage. As we've talked about earlier, his normal attacks are, I mean, technically they have a bit of an AoE, I think, but it's not very big, so they're mostly single target, whereas his charge attacks have a pretty decently sized AoE. What that means is when you're in AoE, when you're against multiple enemies, you're gonna want to use your charge attacks. And when you're using your charge attacks, none of the damage percent you get from his signature is actually helping you in any way. It is obviously a good weapon, right? It is obviously a good weapon for normal attacks, and when you're in single target, it is by far his best choice, in a very similar manner to like Homa and Hu Tao, where like it, for what he does, it gives a lot of stats and it's enough to put it quite a bit above the others. But when you're in AoE, you kind of want to charge attack, and if you're doing that, it's not even his best option, because it doesn't give charge attack damage. I'd say it's generally gonna be his best in slot, because even in single target, or even in AoE, it's still a good weapon, because it's obviously still a high base attack, crit substat weapon that gives a bit of attack speed. It's still good, so if you end up going for it for the single target, you don't need to change out of it when you're in AoE. But I don't think I want to really recommend it as like the obvious always best weapon for him. Kaguras! No! Kaguras buffs your skill damage. Wanderer's normal attacks are normal attack damage, and his charge attacks are charge attack damage. So Kaguras doesn't do shit. It's still a stat stick. It still has 5-star stats on a weapon, so it's still fine on him, but it's not great. And there's very often going to be situations where you have 4-star weapons that are better than it. Memory of Dust. So Memory of Dust is obviously a pretty bad weapon, right? No. Memory of Dust is not a bad weapon. All the like shield weapon things, it's not that they're bad, it's that they don't really have a lot of users. Very often, putting a shield on your team is difficult. If it's only for the weapon passive, it's not really worth it. But like we talked about a little bit earlier, he's pretty vulnerable. He doesn't have any form of resistance to interruption, so you already have a bit of an incentive to run him with a shield. Whether it be Zhongli, Thoma, Lila, Diona, shields are generally something that he kinda likes. Specifically with Thoma and Diona, you also get more value out of them than you usually do, because with Thoma he gains 30% attack, with Lila or Diona, he gains 20% crit rate. And then on top of that, because he has a part of his thing that's normal attacks, he can proc Thoma a bunch, and normal or charge attacks is something that Thoma's Constellations can actually synergize with as well. Thoma's Constellation 6 buffs normal charge and plunge attack damage. When you have a shield up, and if you don't have too many external sources of attack percent, the shield weapons are actually really good. The biggest issues is that generally you often just don't have a shield up, and or you have a lot of sources of attack percent. In Wanderer's case, if you're playing him with Bennett and you're getting all that attack from Bennett, it's not that good, because the attack is still valuable, but you'd rather have crit or damage percent to multiply all the attack you're getting from Bennett instead of just adding to it with the Memory of Dust attack percent. But if you're not using Bennett, if instead you're using him in a freeze team, in a taser team, where you just don't actually have Bennett or that many attack buffs, then Memory of Dust can actually be potentially his best option. If you're in AoE with a very low amount of external buffs, Memory of Dust can actually be his best option, which is kind of crazy. My point with this isn't you gotta go for Memory of Dust, because please don't. It's not a very versatile weapon. You can only gain stacks when you're off field, so many of the like Catalyst users can't really make use of it. It's only attack percent, so EM scaling Catalyst users can't make that good of a use of it. It's not a very good weapon to have on your account, but if you have it, it is pretty good on Wanderer. And specifically when you're doing charge attacks, it can actually be better than his signature. Lost Prayers is kind of in a similar boat without the condition, where it gives damage percent and crit, which are stats that are always good. So whether you're playing him with Bennett or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Lost Prayers is always nice. One thing that a lot of people don't know about Lost Prayers is that it doesn't actually necessarily start ticking when you swap into a character. Right, so here, right? Oh my god, it's gonna be hard to tell because... Right, you can see like here, the Lost Prayers stacks I'm gaining. I'm at 3 now. I swapped back to her. Took me a little while to get the... I already have my first stack, even if it hasn't been 4 seconds. Because the timer keeps ticking even when you're not on field, so if you swap right before the 4 seconds are up, you basically gain your first stack instantly. Which means that the average amount of stacks that you'll get is a little bit higher than what you'd expect if you just always assume that you start at 0. Which makes it a little bit better. If you end up using his burst at the end of your E, his burst is going to be benefiting from, having been on field for a while, so you'll get a bunch of stacks on it. It's kind of just a stat stick. It works on both normal and charge attacks, but it's not really amazing anywhere. I'd say it's also just a solid alternative. Atlas, also a solid alternative. People very often underestimate how much damage Skyward Atlas's passive actually ends up doing. It's not like an insane amount, and far from it. Like you're not gonna carry your team just with that, but it is not an insignificant amount of damage either. It's about 4% more damage from the Atlas passive, which isn't like insane, but 4% more damage is also not bad, right? People tell you to refine your Serpent Spine for less than that, right? A refine on Serpent Spine is less than 4% damage. So even though, sure, it's not an insane passive, and like it isn't, right? Like it's not insane, because it's physical damage, people tend to just forget it exists and forget it's there. It does still make a bit of a difference. It makes Skyward Atlas a pretty nice option overall. Because it's an attack percent weapon, it obviously can have the same issue as Memory of Dust, where it loses some value when you play Scaramouche or Wanderer with a bunch of attack buffs. But unlike Memory of Dust, it doesn't just give you attack, it also gives you a bit of damage percent, so it doesn't get punished by it as hard. Dodoco Tails. Dodoco Tails is a very interesting weapon because it's never been good on anyone before. I've basically never talked about Dodoco Tails. Well, that changes now, because if you end up being in an AoE situation and spamming your charge attacks, this weapon is very good actually. It's not that great if you play him with Bennett, but if you play him with something other than Bennett, and so all the attack percent you gain from Dodoco isn't just like diluted basically, it's actually a pretty fucking solid option. Almost as good as the 5-star options. Dodoco Tails is gonna be your general best free-to-play option. I would recommend just going Dodoco Tails and charge attack spamming over going a different option and normal attack spamming, even in single target. It won't necessarily be the highest, but if you do your charge attacks like with the right timing and you buffer them properly, they become like pretty fucking good. But I don't know if I want to, like, I guess best free-to-play in AoE. Eye of Perception, surprisingly palatable. I'm not gonna say good, but I know that a lot of people don't have Dodoco, and Mappa is like not great, and you might not want to go for Blackliff because it's Star Glitter. Eye of Perception is a gacha weapon. Maybe you got an R5 Eye of Perception without ever getting a single Widsith. Eye of Perception has the same thing as Skyward Atlas, where because it's physical damage, people tend to discount it, but it actually works like Beto's Burst in the sense that it can bounce between enemies. It can only bounce 4 times instead of 5, so that means it's only up to 2 times on the main target, but you can actually get 2 procs per rotation once you're at higher refines, and if you're in AoE, that's a pretty decent thing. It's not good, but it's funny, and so if you're into funny, you can do that. Blackliff agate, generalist, BIS, free to play. It's always gonna be good. His biggest issue is that he doesn't synergize well with any of the like craftable catalysts, which means that the only one that you can guarantee that's like pretty decent on him is gonna be Blackliff agate, but it's not like very good on him, it's just okay. Mappa mare is just like Same for Frostbearer, I guess. They're just like Solar Pearl, Okage. It's not that good actually because you don't actually get good uptime on your passive. So the passive buffs your normal and charge attacks when you deal burst and skill damage. But you only do skill damage when you cast your E. And if you cast your burst, it cancels the rest of your E. Which means that for the first 6 seconds of your E, you have it, and after you don't. Which means that it's not as good as it otherwise could be. And then finally, Widsith is generally gonna be your best in slot 4-star option. Obviously, Widsith, I mean, I've talked about it in the Yai pre-release. Sorry, in the Yai Ask the Jeff, the Nahida pre-release and post-release. Widsith it's a front-loaded weapon. If you get the wrong buff, it sucks. If you get the right buff, damage go boom. On average, it's pretty solid. And when you get the right buff, it's very good. But when you get the wrong buff, it's like meh. If you're willing to go through those hoops, then Widsith is a very good option for him. If you're not, then not necessarily. One thing that I want you guys to remember is if you end up going for a team with 2 cryo units, where you get the cryo buff plus cryo resonance, plus if you're going Rosaria, Rosaria's buff, plus Wanderer's crit ascension, you're starting at 74.2% crit rate. That means that with Solar Pearl, you're already over 100, and then you're wasting some stats. Same thing for Lost Prayers. So just do keep that in mind if you end up going for a team with cryo units. But yeah, that kind of does it for the weapons. I guess I can order them.